Check two. 1, 2. Hey, hey. Check two. Check two. Check two. Check 2. 1, 2. Hey, hey. Check 2. Check 2. Check 2. 1, 2. Can you hear me? Okay, great. If I turn this down, check, check. Can you still hear me? Okay, check 2.
Marlon, are we ready to go?
Check 2. 1, 2. Hey, hey. Hello, hello, everybody. Check 2. Check 2. Okay, great.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Seize Knowledge, Epilepsy Challenges and Resources. On behalf of Metropolitan State University, we'd like to welcome all of the people we have here in the audience live, as well as those we have streaming. And just for those that are on our streaming site, to let you know, we do not have live captioning available this afternoon due to a technical glitch, but the recording that we're making will have captions later as soon as we get that posted, and we'll let you know when that's available. Couple of housekeeping announcements. This event is part of our National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and we are co-sponsoring this event with between the Center for Accessibility Resources, the Veterans and Military Student Services, Health and Wellness Services, our Metro State Veterans Network, and the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota. So this has taken many, many hands to put together, and we appreciate everybody's input on this and hope that you learn a lot. Breakout sessions will be held after this main session, and they are in the lower level of the building we're in, Founders Hall. They are in rooms L117, 118, 119, and 120. The traumatic brain injury and epilepsy in veterans will be in L117. What the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota can do for you is in L118. And mental health and epilepsy is in L119, and then the individual consultations are in L120. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to anybody with Epilepsy Foundation or Metro State name tag on, and they'll help direct you where you need to go. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda from the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota and get things started.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So we're going to go ahead and kind of just get started and go through the information that we have for you guys today. Really, we're breaking it down into the 10 things you should know about epilepsy. Epilepsy is a very complex condition. It's definitely not a black and white and very individualized. So we want to be able to give you guys just some basic knowledge and basic information so that you know a little bit more about seizures and epilepsy. Next slide. I want to start out with just how prevalent epilepsy is. I think this is something that we really don't appreciate or hear as much about as we hear about a lot of other chronic conditions. The big statistic that we use is that 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their life. So that is a huge statistic, and we know that it can be diagnosed at any age, so we definitely see it across the lifespan. And then you can see kind of through the other infographics too that we know there's about 2 million, which recently the CDC did some new research, and they found it was actually right around 3 million people, and that when we talk about around the world, of course, that's even more. The other thing too is that with epilepsy, knowing that it can happen kind of at any age, there is a more popular age group that we do see the prevalence in, which is at 0 to 18. And then we're also seeing it being diagnosed for the first time very commonly in individuals 50 and older. So again, we're seeing it in that later, that older adult, later life population. Next slide. So the first thing to get into to talk about is that epilepsy is a neurological condition. So on the next slide, I have information about really the difference between what maybe you've heard, maybe some myths, misconceptions. Epilepsy has been around since the Greek and Roman times. We have a lot of documentation about epilepsy and seizures being around, and I think through a lot of that time there have become a lot of myths and misconceptions and a pretty negative stigma that can be attached to it. So we know that epilepsy, it's not contagious, it's not a mental illness, and it's not a mental impairment. But what epilepsy is, on the next slide, has information about what it actually is. So it's a medical condition. The two main things are that it's neurological and reoccurring. So people can have seizures for hundreds and hundreds of different reasons. They could have a medication side effect, they could be intoxicated, they could be having, they could have diabetes or some kind of other illness. And really the big thing with epilepsy is that it's neurological, or kind of unprovoked is the other term that they use with that sometimes. So knowing that something else in the body didn't necessarily provoke the seizures to happen. And then you also might see or hear the term seizure disorder, and they mean exactly the same thing. Some physicians and providers only use the word epilepsy, some only use the word seizure disorder, and they mean exactly the same thing. So just know sometimes it's people's comfortability level, or maybe all that they know, so the words can be used interchangeable. So for number two, kind of what is actually happening to, or just to kind of follow up off of that, not to two yet, but what actually happens to the brain during a seizure is that in our brain, kind of similar to the picture that is up there, it really is like this lightning storm. So in our brain, we have all of these pathways, and on the pathways there's millions of neurons that travel along the pathways that makes our brain send messages to our body. And so all of those neurons carry an electrical charge, and as they move from one connection to the other, again, it sends all the messages, helps us walk, talk, and eat. And sometimes when those neurons misfire or have an electrical charge, kind of like a little lightning bolt, is when the seizure happens. And so that means that misfiring could just happen in one part of the brain, or it could be happening across the whole brain on both hemispheres. So it's all about where that misfiring is happening of what the seizures can look like. And so that's why seizures can look so many different ways, and we'll get into that details a little bit more. So number two, there are 40 different seizure types, and that is something even I've been at the foundation for a little over 7 years, and when I first started, we used to kind of say there was around 20, and I know when I first started, I really had only heard of the two, the grand mal and the petit mal. And now we know through more research and more work that has been done kind of across the world that they have decided they really want to look more in depth to what's actually happening in the brain, and so how these seizures can look different ways. So we know that there are lots and lots of different seizure types, and that it's all about where that misfiring is happening of what the seizure can look like. They're going to start by classifying where is that misfiring happening. So that's usually the first thing, trying to figure out, is it happening, having a focal onset or partial, so it's just in part of the brain, and which means, again, wherever that misfiring is, or is it a generalized seizure, which means that on both hemispheres or across the whole brain, that misfiring is happening. This is just kind of one of the newer, the International League Against Epilepsy is the kind of worldwide organization that heads up a lot of the research and kind of naming stuff that goes into epilepsy, and this is one of their kind of newer model of how they break down what different seizures look like, and kind of through their naming things. So Like I said, it starts with the generalized and the focal, and then underneath kind of all of the other names and the different ways that they can look. So on the next slide, we're really going to break it down, number 3, and talk about the 4 most common types. I think if you asked anybody that knows a lot about epilepsy, I doubt that they could name all 40 different types and kind of what the names are. We know that we really just want to know what are the more common versions, and what are the things that you can look for, and what are the things that you need to know to be able to respond appropriately. I don't think that it's anybody in the community's job to be able, as soon as you see a seizure, to say, oh, yep, that's a complex partial. It's really just knowing, okay, seizures can look different ways, and I know they can look possibly like this. How can I, as a witness, understand that and be able to respond appropriately? So kind of the first one I'm going to talk about is the simple partial seizure, or it's called focal seizure without change in awareness. When they're looking at seizure types, the majority of time they're looking at the level of consciousness and the level of awareness. So with this kind, with the focal seizure without change in awareness, there's no loss of consciousness and no loss of awareness. So the individual could be having a conversation with you, and you may not have any clue that they're having a seizure. Sometimes it can be something a little more obvious, where maybe their arm is shaking or their leg is shaking. Other times it could be more of a sensory thing. So they might smell something or taste something or hear something that's not there, see something that's not there. So it can be really different for the individual. Some people, that's the only seizure type that they have. There's a woman that we know that she, her simple partial seizures were, sometimes she would hear ringing bells, other times she would maybe get this really strong sense of deja vu, and other times she would look out and hallucinate that people didn't have arms. So it was different for her kind of every time, and they were usually pretty brief, but she didn't have any other seizure types. Some people might have this, and it's kind of an aura, or maybe a warning sign to let them know that they're going to have another seizure. I think a lot of times this seizure type can go undiagnosed because sometimes people just don't realize that it's happening, or realizing that there's that pattern of it happening over and over again. So sometimes it could be something where people might see something visual, and then maybe in 30, 45 minutes they're going to have a tonic-clonic seizure. Other times it can be right beforehand. Really depends on the individual. So the next seizure type we're going to talk about is the complex partial seizure, or the focal seizure with change in awareness. This is actually the most common seizure type. Around 60% of individuals with epilepsy have the complex partial, and it's also probably one of the most commonly misunderstood, because it looks like a lot of other, it can look like a lot of other things. Sometimes people think they're over-medicated, or they think they're intoxicated, but the thing with seizures, and especially with this kind, is how you can tell the difference really between a seizure and some other things is that seizures are brief and they have a sudden onset. So they're not going to come on slowly over time. It's going to have that abrupt start, and they're going to be brief, usually between 3 to 5 minutes. Could be even less, could be a little bit more, but that sudden onset is really kind of what is helpful, and especially with the complex partial, because with this one, their awareness is 100% gone, but their consciousness is just altered. So it's not like they're going to have this sudden loss of muscle tone. They still might be able to stand up. They still might be able to walk around a little bit, but that awareness is 100% gone. And you can really tell by looking in their eyes, because I think they kind of may have a vacant look or seem to be staring kind of right through you. And so, again, how this seizure will usually happen is that sudden onset. They might kind of stare off. Sometimes they're going to have some sort of repetitive, purposeless movement. So it could be that seizures is they do tend to be stereotypical. So they tend to look the same every time. Not for everyone, because again, epilepsy is super individualized, but usually you are going to see that pattern and kind of those same behaviors and same motions. So the next kind I'm going to talk about is the absence seizure. It used to be called the petit mal. In 1989, the CDC changed the names from petit mal and grand mal to kind of what we call them now. So petit mal means small bad, and grand mal means big bad. So they've kind of moved away from that negative connotation that's behind those words. And the word looks like absence, but it is pronounced absence, which is the French word for absence. So this one is our most common, usually during the early elementary years. So this is when we see it kind of first diagnosed. And again, this is another common one that can be underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed, or sometimes completely missed because it's really brief. It can be 15, 20 seconds, even less. It's really like a light switch going on and off. And it is, because it's a generalized seizure, so it's involving the whole brain, there's no processing of information coming in, and there's no information going out. So even though it's a brief amount of time, they're still missing all of that